This video will go through the process of importing historical production or injection data into Builder. The production or injection file can be created in an ASCII text format, Excel, or in a software like Reservoir, and then imported into Builder using the production/injection data wizard. The format of the production file is up to the user, but the better the file is organized, the easier it is to import. So if there aren't proper delimiters separating the rows and columns, the wizard may not be able to import the data correctly. To get started with the import process, navigate to Wells and Recurrent in Tree View, click on the arrow beside it, and select Import Production/Injection Data. In this window that opens up, you can define what type of file you're importing and how the data is separated in the file. The first option lets you select the type of file that's being imported. So if you've created the file using Excel, or if you've created it in a text file, you can just leave the general option selected as it is. But if you have an FHF file, or if you've created the production injection file in Merak, then you can choose the appropriate option. In this case, I will just be importing a text file, so I'll leave the general option selected as it is. In this next option here, you have to select what file that you're importing. So to do that, click on the Browse button, and then navigate to the directory where your production file can be found. I'm already in the correct directory, and I'm going to select this file here. Typically, the production file will have the extension .prd, so I'm going to select my .prd file and click OK. So in the bottom section here, you have to select if the columns in your file have been separated by a fixed width, or if other type of delimiter actually separates the columns. In the file I chose to import, the columns are separated by tabs, so I will select the second option. So I'll just leave the option delimited selected as it is. The last option at the bottom is if you have commas in your file, so you can specify how the commas separate the data in your file. Since I don't have any commas, I'm just going to ignore this option and click Next. So in step 2, you have to tell Builder which line has your first date and which line has the first well name in your text file. So in this particular file, they're both exactly in the same row. So my first date is in my third row, and my first well name is also in my third row. But it's important to note that this is not always the case. Since you can set up the file in whatever manner you like, you can choose to set it up in a way that the first date is in a different row than the first well name. It doesn't really matter. All that matters is you select it correctly when you get to this step. So I've selected my third row for my first date and my third row for my first well name, so I'm just going to click Next. So step 3 is where you specify which delimiters separate your columns. The production file that I imported is actually separated by tabs, so if I was to unselect the tab button, Builder will no longer know how my columns are separated. So as you can see here, everything is just mashed together when I deselect the tab option. So I'm going to select the tab option again to properly space out my columns. One thing to note is that sometimes having all the options selected, like I have in this case, can result in issues as well. So it's always the best practice to just deselect the delimiters that are not actually separating your data. So I'm going to unclick space and semicolon because I'm not using those two delimiters, and just leave the tab option selected. So once you've done that, click Next. So the next step is where you tell Builder what each column in the imported production file represents. So my first column here, that's my well name. So at the top, I'm going to select well/group name. For the next column, I'm just going to leave date/time selected as it is because that's what this column represents. And it's important to select the correct format of your date. In this particular case, my production file has it defined as month, day, year, so the default is correct. But if yours is different, you will need to adjust them accordingly. So if your dates are date, month, year, date, year, month, you have to select the appropriate option. So the next 3 columns, you have to specify what each column represents. So the third column is my oil produced. So I'm going to click on the drop-down menu and select oil produced. And then when I do that, I have to make sure that all the other options are filled out correctly. So this option tells it that it's a daily rate. These are the units. If you're importing something in different units, you have to specify that here. The expected period, I'm importing data every single month, as you can see here. So I'm just going to leave it selected as monthly, and I'm not missing any dates, so I'm just going to leave this selected as 0. So when you're importing this data, you have to make sure that everything here is correct, or the imported data will be incorrect. My fourth column here represents the water produced, so I'm going to select water produced. And then the fifth column represents the gas produced, so I'm going to select that here. All this other stuff is correct. So once you have everything set up exactly as you want it, you can just click next to move on to the next step. So this is the last step of the wizard, and it just tells you all the wells for which you're importing the data and what the primary constraint is going to be for all of them. By default, Builder has set the primary constraint to liquid produced. If I wanted to change the primary constraint to something else, say oil produced, I can do so by highlighting any well or all the wells, right-clicking, and then select any other type of constraint. In this case, I'm just going to leave it as a liquid produced constraint, so I'm not going to select any other option. But if you would like to, you have the option to do so. So once you're done this step, just click on Finish to finish this import wizard. And then you'll get a window asking you to select the last simulation date. Typically, the last simulation date is going to be the last date that you've imported. So I'm going to select off this last option here. So by checking this date off, I'm telling the simulator that this 2010-0201 is the last date of my simulation. So once you've done that, click Close. So all the well data has actually been imported. So to view the data that you've imported, click the plus sign besides well, and then double click on any one of your wells for which you imported the data. I'm just going to double click on well 1. And if I click on the Constraints tab, you'll see that 2 different constraints have been added in. My primary constraint is a liquid rate constraint based on what I've specified in my historical data. And by default, the simulator has added in a minimum BHP constraint of 200 kPa for all the producer wells. This constraint is to ensure that the simulator does not drop the BHP to atmospheric conditions at the bottom hole, since this would be very unrealistic. So by default, whenever you import data for producer wells, this minimum bottom hole pressure of 200 kPa gets automatically added in. All these other alter keywords after the original constraint just change the liquid constraint based on what's being shown in the production file. So as you can see, as I scroll down, the STL constraint changes, and that's based on whatever the constraint is in my historical data. So I'm just going to click OK to get out of this window. And that's how you import production or injection data into Builder. Thank you for watching.